All right.
All good?
All good.
Cool.
Okay. Well, hi, folks, and welcome to another episode of Changing Minds, the series that uses psychology and neuroscience to better understand human behavior. I'm your host, Joe Devlin. Today, we're talking about human cooperation, something that seems incredibly relevant at the moment. With me is Professor Nichola Raihani, Professor of Evolution and Behavior at UCL. Welcome, Nichola.
Hi, thanks, Joe. Thanks for the invite.
I'm so glad you're here. Now, I believe you've prepared a few questions for our audience. Is that right?
Yeah, so we thought it would be interesting to start with a quick poll of a few questions just about the recent social interactions you might have had. So I think Joe is going to somehow reveal those, or they are revealed already. Oh, there they are. Okay.
Okay, good. So I think people should be able to see the poll. And I'd just like to point out to everybody that all the responses are completely anonymous, so we don't record who says what. So do please feel free to share your answers over the next 10, 15 minutes as we talk. And also, I'd like to remind everybody to share any questions that you have for Nichola in the question and answer board. So even as we're talking, feel free to share any thoughts as we go along. So Nichola, maybe we just get started by just sort of saying that my experience recently has been that cooperation seems to be sort of at an all-time high. When I look on like my own street, I see neighbors like literally sharing food with one another, and obviously going out and buying groceries and medicines and things. Is that everyone's experience, or is this just my weird street?
It's hard to say. I think loads of us have been really pleasantly surprised by the sense of community that has seemed to have sprung up seemingly out of nowhere in response to this new strange set of circumstances that we find ourselves in. So I think many of us now will have experience of having either a new WhatsApp channel or a newly active WhatsApp channel with your neighbors on your street. Maybe you might have helped or been helped by people who live near you with getting food or things like this. And I think it is potentially surprising for people because I think, well, for many of us that live in big cities, that sense of community isn't always obvious. And I think there is this slight fear that when we do experience crisis, that will actually bring out the worst in people rather than the best in people, and that we will see cooperation completely sort of fraying at the edges. And that, I think, for many people, it's been a real pleasant surprise that at least at this local scale, that hasn't been their experience. In where I live, we've seen lots of these groups that have sprung up to help residents and things like that. But we've also seen a lot of civic action and community action to try to help like local businesses. And sometimes that has also then been reciprocated back by the businesses. So, for example, just one interaction I had with a bookstore near where I live that had to close to customers. So I had to phone up and make an order for some books. It was my little boy's birthday and I needed to buy him some presents. And the lady who ran the bookstore obviously realized I must have needed something to take my mind off things as well, because when she wrapped up his gift for him, she also just gave me for a book for her favorite novel. And you kind of think that's a really, there's something really meaningful about that gesture when you think that the kind of difficulty a shop like that will be going through at the moment. There's just something really heartwarming about it. And I think lots of us have had experiences like that where we really feel that there has been this real upsurge in cooperation.
Yeah, no, that's really lovely too, that people are doing things like that. And it's not just neighbors and people but that small businesses and things are being part of this, and it's very human, that level of helping. But
Mm-hmm.
the other thing I'm thinking about is when I look in the news and I see things like in the US that there's this real lack of cooperation across states, where you have places like New York or California where they seem to be particularly hard hit by the virus, and they don't necessarily have enough medical supplies. And then other states that are sort of less affected are essentially hoarding equipment. They're not sharing, and in some sense, it's not even like lack of cooperation. It's more like competition.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so I think that what many of us have experienced is this sort of hyper-local cooperation occurring at a very, very proximal scale. And it is noteworthy in that it does seem to be very circumscribed. And actually, what we're also seeing at the same time is these sort of tight circles of cooperation draw together, is we're seeing at more distal scales that sometimes that cooperation is starting to unravel, and that we're seeing examples of people either, well, famously in the news, not adhering to social distancing guidelines, or maybe buying too much stuff in the supermarket and not leaving enough for other people. And even on this nation scale, as you've said, where we also are seeing that at some scales, cooperation is actually being crowded out by competition, and that, you know, yes, in the US, states are competing for ventilators and trying to outbid one another to get these ventilators. I think perhaps some of the harder hit countries in the EU feel like they could have been helped more by some of the other member states in their time of need, and maybe that help wasn't forthcoming because those countries also, you know, had their own concern and that they might need those supplies for themselves. So there's a dichotomy here, which is that at one scale we're seeing an increase in cooperation, and then at a more distal scale we're also starting to see that kind of cooperation is starting to unravel a little bit. And so one helpful metaphor for thinking about this, I think, or one way you could think about this, is to think of cooperation as being a bit like an onion.
Sorry. Cooperation's like an onion. Would you care to explain that a little bit?
Yeah, so it's probably, I've got a video clip, and maybe that will be the most helpful way for me to explain what I mean. So let me just quickly share my screen and go here. Here we go. Okay, so can you see that?
Yes.
Okay, here we go.
For your information, there's a lot more to ogres than people think.
Example?
Example? Okay, ogres are like onions.
They stink?
Yes. No.
Oh, they make you cry?
No.
Oh, you leave them out in the sun, they get all brown, start sprouting little white hairs.
No. Layers. Onions have layers. Ogres have layers. Onions have layers. You get it. We both have layers.
Oh, you both have layers. Oh. You know, not everybody like onions.
Okay. Okay, so yeah, so cooperation is a bit like ogres in that cooperation is also like onions, in that it also has layers. So if you think, if you imagine an onion that you've cut in half, and it has a series of concentric circles, it's made up of these layers. And you can think of this as being like a reasonable metaphor for the kinds of societies that humans live in. So we live in what we call hierarchically nested societies. That basically just means we live in groups inside larger groups. So we all live in families. Those families are nested inside neighborhoods and larger communities. And those communities are nested inside nation states, for example. Now, in principle, we can cooperate at any layer of that onion. So you can cooperate with your friends and family, or you can cooperate at the societal level, like, for example, when you pay your taxes, or you can even cooperate at a much more global level when you do things like, for example, environmentally friendly behaviors that provide global benefits. So we can cooperate at any layer of this onion, but one of the difficulties is that cooperation at the inner layers is often directly traded off against cooperation at the more distal layers. And another way of thinking about that is to realize that cooperation quite often has victims. So cooperation at inner layers often results in victims of that cooperation that occur at these outer layers of this onion.
I love the idea of victims of cooperation. I don't think that's an expression that had ever really crossed my mind before. Can you give just an example of a victim of cooperation?
Yeah, so actually there's one example I really like, which is I read about it in the news last year, and it's a story of at a US airport, and involving Uber and or Lyft drivers, not disparaging either, just to say it's this kind of rideshare platform. So basically, apparently what happens is when the planes start to land, let's say the Uber drivers coordinate together to all switch off their app at the same time, which then has the consequence that there's a perception of a lot of demand as the passengers are coming off the plane and ordering an Uber, and not very much supply because no one's there with an Uber app switched on. So basically, they wait until they reach the threshold for surge pricing, at which point then whoever's in charge of coordinating the effort will say, okay, everyone switch on your app again. And now they can basically take these passengers home who are just going to pay slightly more to be journeyed home by the drivers. Now, in a way, doing that doesn't sound like the most cooperative thing to do, right? It seems like you're kind of doing something to swindle the passengers in a way. But on the other hand, when you think about what's going on among the drivers, they actually do have to cooperate to produce this public good. So every driver has a short-term incentive to try and turn their app on slightly quicker than everyone else to make sure that they don't miss out on a fare altogether. And so there is a cooperative element to this at this lower scale, at this inner scale of an onion among the drivers, which results in victims, the victims in a way being the passengers in this case, who pay slightly more. And so this kind of really neatly illustrates, I think, how you can have cooperation at one level that manifests as competition at another. And in the real world, we see, you could also think of corruption and nepotism as being similar kinds of examples of this, in lower level cooperation, helping your friends and family at the expense of a societal level public good.
You mean, so if I just hypothetically appoint my son-in-law and his and my daughter to be some sort of high-level government position when they weren't elected, that's cooperation in my family, if not so much benefiting perhaps the rest of the world. That's where that kind of thing comes.
And also, I mean, I think it's really important that we don't, even though you have to try to kind of put aside the moral overtones of these kinds of findings. In this, we know that societies do vary quite broadly on this spectrum of like how tight is this, what layer of this onion is the moral layer at which we cooperate. And I read a really nice quote around saying, on one hand, you could disparage somebody who favors this inner level of saying, oh, that guy just always helps his friends. So, but then you can equally disparage the person who has the broader, more universalistic moral circle by saying that guy won't even help his friends. So, I mean, it's really a question of perspective of like which is the layer we should be cooperating at. And there's no real there's not really a normative or right or wrong answer, but we do know that this is something that varies quite profoundly within and between societies.
That makes a lot of sense. But the more I think about it then, the more surprising it is for me that this kind of a complex behavior has evolved, right? I mean, I'm not an evolutionary theorist, but I thought that Darwin's theory of natural selection was really much more about competition for sort of limited resources. What got us working together?
Yeah, so I think if you were to have like a very narrow reading of Darwin's theory of evolution by natural selection, there is a real emphasis there on it's a struggle for survival, it's nature red in tooth and claw, it's the survival of the fittest, it's every individual for themselves. And if you stick with that very narrow reading of Darwinian evolution, cooperation does appear to be a bit of a puzzle, because it seems to imply that individuals are setting aside their own personal interests in the service of helping another individual, and that doesn't seem to be like something that would be consistent with this Darwinian perspective. However, what we know is that in fact cooperation is entirely consistent with a Darwinian perspective, because it involves when it allows individuals, the cooperating individuals, a better means to compete, essentially. So cooperation is favored when it gives you a way to get ahead of individuals that don't cooperate. And this is something that we see across the animal kingdom. We're not the only species that cooperate. It's something which can be favored, can be entirely consistent with a Darwinian perspective, and can be favored by evolution.
So then how do we know how this came about in people? Like what's the history of cooperation in us as our species?
Yeah, so humans are, we are the most cooperative primate and the most cooperative ape on the planet. And probably the reason for that has a lot to do with the kind of environments that we evolved in, which were very, very changeable, and also very difficult to live in. So they were very harsh. They were rapidly drying out over the period of human evolution. Food was pretty hard to come by, where there was loads of giant, nasty kind of Pleistocene predators roaming around that thought humans looked a lot like lunch. By that point, we were probably, but by that point we would have been mostly living on the ground, so it's not as easy to escape from these predators. So humans had two like really big problems that for most of our time on Earth, which was find food and avoid being eaten by things that want to eat you. And in order to make a living or to eke out an existence in that kind of really harsh environment, we really needed one another. So we really needed, only a cooperative ape could have survived and prospered in circumstances like that. And that helps to explain why we are so profoundly cooperative in comparison to the other great apes, and in fact, in comparison to any other primate species.
So in terms of protecting ourselves and also making sure that we had the resources to survive, that's where cooperation really came in. It allows us to thrive as a species, even if as an individual, maybe we weren't as great. But it feels like that's not the case anymore, right? I mean, the reality is that, if I don't go out and hunt something today, I'm fine. I've got stuff in the fridge, right? Or I've got money in the bank. I can call, I can call a restaurant. So that seems like maybe it's less true now, because society, these institutions have taken over some of that role. Is that true, or?
Yeah. So let me just go back to one point you made, which is that so basically the reason humans cooperate is not because that was advantageous for our species, but rather because cooperative humans outperformed less cooperative humans over evolutionary time, right? So cooperation was was a way to get ahead, and we relied on one another. We were highly interdependent, and yes, that is really profoundly different to, for many of us, to the kind of lifestyles we live now, where the kind of key basic needs that we have are, to some extent, so basically the access to food, staying healthy, and being protected from threats, for example, from other groups or things like this. Those kinds of basic needs for many of us now are met, or to some extent met, by the state. So for example, in the UK where I live, there's a National Health Service which provides me with healthcare. We have a government and we have a currency called the pound, and that means that I can store my own money in a bank, and that I can then plug into a market economy, so that if and when I need food, I can get it, and I don't have massive fluctuations in, I have food one day, but then for 2 weeks I don't manage to find anything. So that's a really recent state of affairs for our species. So if we think about the period of time that humans have been on Earth for, if we think about that in the context of the history of Earth itself, we know Earth is 4.5 billion years old, right? So that's a massive number no one can get their head around. So if you think of that instead as a calendar year, with the Earth kind of coming into existence on day one of that year, humans entered the stage on December the 31st about half an hour before midnight. So we haven't been here very long in any sense. And all of the modernization of the human species has occurred on that timescale within the last 60 seconds that we've been on Earth. So access to market economies and a state providing a security net for people, and the ability to store up resources so that you can get things while they're plentiful, and then you can save them for when they're not so plentiful. All those kinds of means that we have in industrialized economies for smoothing our supply chain are really, really recent inventions, and they're not even universal on Earth today. There are many humans that don't have access to market economies, for example. And what happens when we don't is that we rely on one another a lot more. If you can't meet your basic needs through self-sufficiency, you meet them by, you have a social security net. You pool that risk in your social network.
Yeah, that's incredible. I mean, I guess I'd never really thought about how recent we are in terms of the planet, and the idea that, you know, this stuff has happened in the last 60 seconds of a year is remarkable. So how does this change with COVID then? Why is this virus messing up cooperation or changing it anyway?
So one thing I think is really interesting is that if you live in a society where the state provides that safety net, then one consequence of that is that you don't need to rely on your social network as much for support, for that kind of critical support that you need for meeting your basic needs in life. So you don't have to put as much, you're not going to be asking as much of your social partners. And one consequence of that is that you can afford to actually broaden out your social network a little bit, and to have a larger pool of individuals that you cooperate with. Even though you don't cooperate quite as much with any of them, you can still afford to broaden out that social circle of people that you extend impartial cooperation to. When that safety net is removed, and to some extent, I think a lot of us are feeling that safety net is to some extent in doubt at the moment. Like, will there be a hospital bed for me if I need it? Can I get access? Can I get to the supermarket? Will I be able to get to the supermarket? Will there be any food there when I get there? Like, some of these like basic things that we take quite for granted have suddenly really been called into question quite abruptly. And I think what we're seeing in response to that, or what we're potentially seeing in response to that, is people starting to pool that risk back into a much smaller, tighter social network, which is this hyperlocal network, which might help to explain why we are seeing these this hyperlocal community spirit starting to thrive at this local scale, while at the same time not necessarily be really extending to more distal scales, if that makes sense.
Yeah, definitely. And I think we actually have some poll results if you wanted to have
yeah, that would be cool. Yeah, let's have a look.
Let's see. Hopefully everybody can see them. Can you see them, Nichola?
Yeah, I can. Yeah.
Okay. So then the prediction here would be that we should be seeing more local cooperation and less perhaps global cooperation. And let's see, what do we see here?
So one, I guess, is a bit equivocal for this idea. Most people saying about the same, nothing has changed. But if you look at more than usual compared to fewer than usual, there's more people are saying more than are saying fewer.
Right, sounds about right.
So do you have a new group? Yeah, that one seems pretty supportive of this idea of this local communication and local cooperation. Right. Okay, so this is actually super interesting, more than usual. So my prediction for 3 would have been that we would have seen that less than usual. I don't know what the sample size is here. It might be, but I would be quite interested to see data from charities as to whether they're getting, whether their donations have increased or not in the last 2 weeks, or whether they've decreased. Yeah, and then we're seeing more giving to local charities as well.
Right. Yeah. No, there's always a risk that when you ask about people giving to charities, that it's more an aspirational answer. But
yeah, there could be a bit of desire, and yeah, maybe we attracted all the cooperative people with the title.
Sure. Yeah, absolutely. So look, if it's okay with you, I'd like to turn to some of the questions from audience members. Is that all right?
Sure.
Okay, so there's a question here from Adam saying, is victim of cooperation going to be related to resource scarcity if there isn't enough of the resource for cooperation at every layer of the onion?
Yeah, I think that, so I think this idea of, we would call it material security, which is your ability to meet your basic needs. If that is threatened in some way or is reduced, then we're going to see, the prediction is, and what you do see in studies is that people will shrink their cooperation down to smaller scales, which basically allows those smaller units to grab more of that resource that's available. And the victim, in a way, I mean, it's not an intentional victim, but the victim would be the individuals who don't manage to grab some of that resource, basically.
And we have a really, what looks to be a hard question to me, good question from Katie, saying, why is it so difficult for us to cooperate globally to tackle problems like climate change?
Yeah, well, that's the $1 million question, isn't it? One thing I would say is that watching how this has played out with, watching how our response has changed, our cooperation has changed in response to this pandemic, doesn't make me massively optimistic about our ability to solve a global public goods problem like climate change. And there's a couple of reasons why that is. So in the case of this pandemic, we know that the threat is real. It's real right now, and lots of people are motivated to avoid getting this disease. And the existence of the disease is, for the most part, maybe a few people, there's a minority of people who doubt the existence of, or doubt the severity, but for the most part, most people agree that this is something that's real and that they don't want to catch, and that we need to do something about it now. And climate change is so much more difficult than that as a global public goods problem to solve, because for many people, not all people on Earth, but for a lot of people on Earth, the problem probably is something which might not be felt by them in their lifetime, or they don't think it will be such a big deal for them in their lifetime. There's a lot more uncertainty around what is the range of outcomes. We know that climate change is real and that the outcomes will be bad, but there's a lot of uncertainty about what that range of badness might be, which leaves a lot of room for people to kind of make their own narrative about how important it is to resolve it. And obviously there's much more, it's going to be much costlier to mitigate the effects of climate change. We're going to have to re-engineer our entire economy to do it. So I don't feel, given that we haven't seen like loads of global cooperation in response to coronavirus, it doesn't make me hugely optimistic that we will manage it with climate change. But that we have to keep hope, obviously, but if you were just to compare the problems side by side, it doesn't look like something where it's not going to be easy for us to do this. We can't do it with what is comparatively an easy thing with this pandemic, and climate change will be a much more difficult problem to solve. Sorry, that's so depressing.
But yeah, you got to call it like it is, right? So bringing it back to sort of a more local level, Elizabeth asks, what do you think about some of the attempts to introduce punishment to secure cooperative behavior, like fining people? Do you think it's effective?
I think we have to be really careful. So I think we need rules in place. And so I think basically one thing that went wrong quite early on was that the government's approach was to just kind of ask people nicely to do something without putting any real incentives in place to encourage that what was needed, which was large scale cooperation. So I think for sure we need incentive structures that incentivize people to do the right thing. But I think we have to be really, really careful about enacting punishment, and in particular punishment that's not perceived to be as legitimate, which some people would say has been the case with some examples some examples of policing in particular, and park closures, have been perceived as being either heavy-handed or just illegitimate. And there's a real risk that if people don't perceive the authorities as being legitimate, that they will stop complying with the behaviours that are needed. And so I think there's a real fine line between incentivizing something and not basically forcing people into something that they feel is illegitimate and that they then will no longer comply with.
Okay, excellent. Thank you. So I'm sensitive to the fact that we're running out of time, and I want to apologize to everyone whose question we didn't get to. If you're interested to learn more about this topic, then Nichola has a new book coming out called The Social Instinct: How We Got from DNA to Democracy. Nichola, do you know when it's going to be released?
I think it will be early next year. I guess everything is a bit shifting timelines at the moment. So
yeah, that's for sure. Okay, well then I'd like to thank my guests, Professor Nichola Raihani, as well as our audience members for sharing their questions. Because next week is Easter Monday, we're going to run the show on Wednesday, April 15th from 4 to 4:30 instead, where our guest will be Professor Sophie Scott, who will be speaking about the importance of talking to friends and family during this time of social distancing. We hope that you can all join us for that. Thank you very much, and goodbye.
Thank you, bye.